Afternoon, Tim. How you doing?
Good afternoon, Shabbar. I am well, as I know are you, and we are both happy and a bit tired because yesterday, at the time of recording, was the last day of the Ryder Cup, which, for those who don't know, is a big Europe versus America golf tournament. And Shabbar loves golf, and I kind of love the Ryder Cup. So we were messaging last night, weren't we? As what looked like a very, very easy, predictable victory for Europe suddenly became very, very hairy, but Europe won in the end, and it was good fun. How are you doing?
Yeah, it was, as they say, it was definitely squeaky bum time around sort of 9 o'clock yesterday, looking as if it was going to be a romping European victory after 2 great days. And then it just suddenly went doolally
Mm.
because the USA, started to pile on some pressure. And at one stage, it looked like, oh my God, this could be like the biggest comeback in golf, well, sporting history, really. The deficit was huge, but Europe pulled through and the Americans didn't win. And that is great as well, because, I think we were both saying that the American fans weren't behaving themselves in the best manner. And, you know, no one wants the Americans gloating for the next 2 years how they,
Well, let me just apologize to our American listeners
well, yeah,
and thank them for listening. But
yes,
we're obviously very partisan
we are
Europeans
in a
today.
respectful way. But yes,
Yeah.
so it's only fitting today that we choose a bit of a golfing theme on the podcast.
Mm.
And something that came up in the lead up to this event was
Mm.
around players getting paid to play in the Ryder Cup.
Mm.
So shed some light on what was happening, and I'll
Mm.
chime in as well. But historically, it's been an event where you play for the badge or the
Right.
privilege, and there have been sort of some rumblings, certainly since the last Ryder Cup, from the US team around, well, hold on, shouldn't we get paid because of the amount of money that gets generated through this event, and all of this sort of stuff? And it became a bit of a hot topic. So we're going to dive into that, because there are two contrasting views from both teams on this idea of getting paid to play in this particular
Mm.
tournament. So it feels like it's a good one
Mm.
to dive into today.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah. And as you say, partly we're just excited by the golf. This is not a golf podcast. We won't and we don't always talk about golf, as regular listeners will know. But every now and then we use a story from wherever and sometimes from golf to, get into a money question. And the other thing to say is we actually had we did one other podcast about the number one golfer in the world, Scotty Scheffler, who is winning everything and has loads and loads of money and fame and success, sort of saying, sometimes I don't know what I'm doing with my life, or is this all there is? And so we used that. And we had a very good response on that one. Yes. So as you say, I'm not the golf expert. Ryder Cup's unusual because most golf is a very individual sport, isn't it? And people play against each other, and obviously you get money for winning. And I guess if you're one of the best golfers in the world, you make a lot of money. Even if you don't win, you make very, very, very good living. And my guess is probably many professional golfers, even if they're not in the top 100, make plenty of money. I don't know how it works. So there's money in the game, and certainly all 24 players in the Ryder Cup over this last weekend will all be, I assume,
Multimillionaires,
multi-millionaires, right?
no doubt.
And you made the very interesting point that for the Ryder Cup, historically, it's the one time they come together and they traditionally don't get paid.
So just to put it into perspective,
Mm.
I think what happens is that you've obviously got Team Europe, Team USA,
Mm.
and they have, let's just call it, a governing body that manages the European tour, where the Europeans generally have played historically, although a lot of them play in the US. And then you've got the US PGA, who run the sort of the US game.
Mm-hmm.
And this event generates, millions and millions of pounds through advertising, sponsorship, etc.
Mm.
Then that money is taken by both tours and then invested back into sort of grassroots, and helps them to develop the game.
Right.
The US traditionally have given an amount to charity on behalf of each player. And I think it's around $200,000 for the last sort of 20 years or so has been given to charity. So there has been an element which is given to the players, but it's diverted straight to a charity that they nominate.
And whereas the Europeans just don't get paid.
I don't think they just say, we don't want to get paid. We're not interested in money.
Yeah.
And therefore the European tour takes that money, revenue, profit, and diverts it back into the game, the grassroots.
So probably lots to dig around there. And we're not going to get into the minutiae of global golf governance. You made a very interesting point. So this came up, and I think it came up this time because some of the American players either did or were reported to say, we should be paid, or the US team sort of did it differently. And it gets in the news. And I'm a layperson, from my perspective, you kind of get this story that the Europeans don't get paid and they're very, very happy and they love it for the badge and the prestige and the honor. And some of the American players, there's more of a debate, right? So maybe there's a cultural thing. But the first thing you pointed out was, all of these guys are incredibly wealthy already. And that's okay, because no reason why wealthy people can't be paid. But if I felt otherwise, that would probably be a judgment or projection on my side. But the first thing you noticed, before we get into the rights and wrongs of being paid or doing things for free or all of this stuff, is how awkward you felt the money conversation was. And for very, very public people whose earnings are all on the internet, you could Google how much does so-and-so earn in a year or lifetime's earning. It's all documented. Yeah. You felt there was some real awkwardness about this money conversation.
It was. Because what happened this year was that in addition to the money that gets directed to the players' charity, they're given an extra amount, which is for them to use how they wish. So it was framed very much along the lines of it's like a stipend sort of thing, and you can do what you want with it. But effectively, this was the result of a little bit of, we're representing our country, fair enough, but we're still taking time out of our life to generate money for the US game of golf. And so it was a case of, we're the players. It's through us that this is attracting millions and millions, and therefore our time needs to be rewarded. And we need a slice of the pie. I'm paraphrasing. No one actually said that, but those were the rumblings from the last Ryder Cup. And so the Europeans also had this discussion, and they were asked, well, do you want to get paid from their tour? And they were like, no, we're not interested in money. We don't want money to come into the equation. It becomes a bit murky and cloudy, and we just love playing. And actually, it's funny because one of the European golfers actually said, I would actually pay to play in this tournament. So you've got two very sort of, you could say ideologies, ethos, whatever you want, but there is a divide, whereas I don't know what's going on in the head of the Americans, but there certainly feels like there's more of an entitlement to be compensated.
Or we might say an assertiveness. Let's keep an open mind, because we'll come on, I think, towards the end of the podcast. And obviously, most people listening to this are not multi-millionaire elite sports people. But many people have the question of, how do I relate to time and money, or how do I feel about doing things for no money? And we can fall into the opposite trap of being too willing to not be paid. And maybe that's not always helpful. So I think let's keep a very open mind. I know you and I are right this morning, proud pro-Europeans, but let's keep an open mind. So generally, in any money investigation, of course, we're using a very rarefied, unusual example today. But for anyone listening, anytime I see a money story on the news, or I notice in myself or a friend or family, we can investigate it and we can be curious. Always try and start with an open mind. And always, if I noticed I haven't got an open mind because I think this way of doing it is better and this way is worse, consider that is mirroring back to you some underlying, probably unconscious, semi-conscious judgment or fixed pattern with money. Doesn't mean we can't have opinions, but if I'm holding my opinion tight, if I think, how dare they ask to get paid, the rich whatevers, that is a judgment coming from probably some unconscious set of value judgments that I have, right? Similarly, if I think how noble and wonderful the Europeans are, everyone should be like that. That's also telling me something about my judgment. So when I start, although I'm very glad that we won the golf, I'm going to stay really open-minded about what might be going on and encourage us and anyone listening to be curious. Now, one thing you pointed out was it seemed like the awkwardness was something about not quite knowing what to do. If I've understood what you're saying correctly, Shabba, the Europeans, it was very clear. The question came up a couple of years ago. We all decided, no, we don't want to get paid. We love doing this for free. It feels right to do free. It seems to me rather than the decision, the Europeans arrived very quickly at a clarity. It's going to be like this. And any time I reach a clarity on anything, not just money, that tends to kind of release attention.
Mm.
So even if they'd all said, yes, we all want to be paid, please, actually the tension might have been in the public's response, but they'd be clear. It sounds like the way the Americans set this up led itself to a lack of clarity. It was, well, we're going to do the charity, and then there's this additional bit, brackets. You could have it for you, or you could give it away, and some of you might keep it, and some of you. So
Yeah.
it feels like they were setting something up that allowed for and even supported a lack of clarity and a bit of a messiness. So is that where some of the awkwardness came from?
I think so. Just picking up from, let's say, what people were saying, and these are, like you said, multimillionaire golfers who are now being quizzed as to, so what are you going to do with the extra? Some people kept quiet. I didn't hear from some people. Some golfers were like, we do a lot of charity in our hometown. I'm not going to keep it. I'm going to give it away. And there's part of me that now also thinks, well, did you secretly want to keep it, but you're just having to say that you want to give it away just to maybe save public image as well? Because the general consensus from the audience, and I think whether you're a golf fan or not, is, well, you're a multimillionaire. This tournament is celebrating coming together as a team, representing your nation. I think the Olympics, there's sort of a parallel with the Olympics, and it's just like, no, you shouldn't get paid. Or I think it's the question. I think the question or the debate is, I think they put that agenda forward that we should get paid. I think if it was I think if it was a case of you've always got paid for it and you can decide whether you keep it, give it away to charity, etc. But I think the fact is that they've introduced this additional bit at the request of the players.
Okay, that's really helpful.
So that's where I think it now becomes a bit like people are looking in and saying, oh, greedy American golfers.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really helpful. So again, for anyone listening to this podcast who is not a top professional golfer, there may be one or two out there. Anytime we change any money pattern, is likely to provoke an emotional response in us and in other people, even if we're very clear. So it sounds like some of the awkwardness was the American golfers, or some of them said, we would like to be paid, or we should be paid for our time, or whatever they said. And that does two things. But the first thing it does is it actually stirs up, if you like, the public money field. So there's a whole load of judgments that get stirred up. So be aware, anyone listening, we've talked about charging and how to price things we do and ask for fees in the last couple of episodes. And I've encouraged people to experiment and play. Anytime I change a set pattern, even if it's done for very positive reasons and I'm very conscious and I feel this is more in service to do it this way, it will stimulate a response, because there's so much unconscious material tied up with money that one way we avoid dealing with the emotion is we just keep the pattern the same. So if I undercharge, I'll always undercharge. I'll just keep undercharging, because as soon as I change it, it stirs something up. Or if I always overcharge or charge this way, it's sometimes easier just to keep things the same. And as soon as we change them, it stirs stuff up. So that sounds like one thing. That's why we're talking about it, right? They changed a pattern. And then I think you make a really interesting point, which is American golfers, or some of them, are saying, well, hang on, somebody is making lots and lots of money. The TV company is making money. The golf course is making money. The US Golf whatever society or association making loads of money. We should be paid for our time. And it's not just the time on the course, it's all their thousands of hours of practicing. So what's unreasonable about that then?
That is a very good question.
I'm not asking you to defend the American golfers, but that's what's wrong with that?
So I think that it comes down to, in these situations where there's a privilege that's afforded to a very select few to go and represent their country, and so if you're looking at it from a very patriotic angle, I would say that, well, the prize or the reward is in being able to participate in this event. That's the first thing. The second thing is, well, if this money is being used for like grassroots, and this is one of the arguments, that if this money is being used in the grassroots, most of these golfers have come from grassroots golf. So this is like the cash cow for the organization, who then, do a lot of good with the money in terms of supporting all of the thousands of up and coming golfers. So why not just let them keep the money and distribute it, as they have been. So it's almost like there's this clash of a principle, but time is money. And I think this is a very prevalent feature of today's world, in terms
time
of
time is money.
Time
I should
is money.
Be paid for my time.
Yeah, I should be paid for and it's almost like disrespectful to not be paid.
Yes, great. So we're going a bit deeper now, which I think is great. We've gone from a news headline and maybe recognize that we'll all have our own judgments into what's really going on here. So I'd like to make some suggestions drawing on key ideas from the money work. You look like you're about to say something.
I was going to say that, but even just saying that, it's disrespectful, that might be a projection of mine, in terms of, so got to be careful.
Well, not too careful. I think the thing is, when we're becoming conscious of this stuff, we can acknowledge that everywhere we look, there's probably projections and judgments. Doesn't mean we have to be careful. We could be relaxed and know we're probably doing it everywhere, and then it becomes quite playful. But you're right. Maybe there's a projection or a judgment about respect. I think the way I'd like to take this conversation is for us to get curious about who or what might be being disrespected. Because I suspect there are, in a way, two worldviews here that do relate to money work, or what we sometimes call in this work the money path and the life path. And if you allow me to be a little poetic, I wonder if one approach resonates with us, which is a kind of more life-centered life path approach, which is, well, we're going to do this whether there's money or not, because we do it for passion, love, the sense of camaraderie, the sense of belonging. I'm not making that right or morally superior. I'm saying it is different and there may be a value in it. And another, saying I should be paid for my time, reflects much more a kind of conventional, what I often call the industrial linear transactional model.
I was just going to say, it almost feels like that the two teams are kind of representing these two sort of I don't know what we call movements.
Yeah, paradigms.
Yeah.
Or something.
One's the very romantic kind of, Europeans. We're doing it for the people that have come in the past and to set legacy for the people in the future. And that was some of the rhetoric that was being used by the European. And the Americans don't really have that. And the course has been played in New York, just 30 miles away from Wall Street. And it's quite ironic in a way that we're looking at it through these lenses.
So this is where I think we must be careful and respectful, actually.
Yeah.
I think we can talk about this as two polarities, and we can, in a fun way, imagine that the Europeans, traditional, romantic, philosophical, idealistic Europeans, and the more commercial, transactional Americans. But I think we need to recognize at the level of the humans involved. I'm going to go further with this idea in a second, but let's not kid ourselves. All those European golfers are multimillionaires. They've all got business managers. They've all got sponsorship deals, and so they should. And I'm assuming they're all perfectly savvy commercial operators, and they ain't stupid. And you can also say being in the Ryder Cup is going to be good for your career and your, okay. And similarly, let's respect the Americans. Many of them will have given their money to charity, and they will also be playing for honor and duty and camaraderie. So this is what often happens when we explore life through polarities, through these different parts. And we've talked about this a lot on the podcast. So maybe to go away from golf for a moment, maybe if I realize I've got ideas with money, it shows I'm a success, then I need to explore my relationship to success and to failure. Or maybe if I believe that with money comes power, then I need to explore my relationship to feeling powerful and also vulnerable and weak. So what we're saying, and this will be familiar to regular listeners, is all of those different psychological ways of being or experiences. We all have them both, but it can be very useful because we don't normally see them, and often we're one-sided, to play with the polarity. So for the purpose of this conversation, I would like to say that I'm sure all of those golfers are commercially savvy, transactional people, and I'm sure they all love their children and their country and their families and are capable of doing romantic things for honor. Having said that,
Europe rules.
well, now, having said that, in this story, I think there is something interesting. And I'd like to explore it and also link it to the golf itself. Yeah. If I'm driven more by a story that I should be paid for my time, that's perfectly reasonable. But if that one trumps my sense of I wish to give my time for free or for romance or for the flag, that's fine. And actually, different people in different situations might need to do that more sometimes, other people in other situations. But what I'm expressing in that moment is more the conventional money logic, as you say, this strange idea, time is money, I should be paid for my time. If everyone else is getting rich off this, the TV companies, then I should. Nothing wrong with that, but I'm in a transactional, instrumental mindset. I put my effort in, I should get my money back. There's a certain individuality in that point. It's my time, my energy. I should be paid for it rather than, well, I put my time in and other people will benefit. So that mindset, as you say, it's near to Wall Street where the golf was run. That's very familiar, right? That's kind of a more typical conventional business logic. It's valid, but one of the things we've said in this podcast is it doesn't actually deliver what we really want in life, both individually and collectively. And what we often say on the podcast is, even though we're all socialized to think we should do that instrumental transactional thing and think about ourselves and our money and our numbers, actually what we really want in life is something that we call more like the life path or the life-centered view. And that's stuff that actually money can't buy. And it's feelings of aliveness, meaning, joy, connection, relationship, creativity, fulfillment, etc. And of course, we still need to pay our bills and find a way to provide food and shelter, so we're not stupid about money. Now, what interests me is my impression from the golf yesterday was that those very, very wealthy European golfers who were not paid, and many of whom have won major tournaments and been incredibly rich, I felt that was, for lots of them, probably the highlight of their professional lives. That what they actually got from that was just so valuable and wonderful, and that it was profoundly meaningful for them, whether or not they were paid. And I'd kind of like to come to that, but I've said a lot. So let me pause. And how are you responding? And what do you think?
Yeah. No, a couple of things. So when you were just saying around the point you made before, the European golfers, that the things that we're after are life-centered, and I don't think that needs any explaining. But I guess I just wanted to pick up on the fact that just because they were paid to play, that doesn't necessarily mean that those things aren't available to them. And
Absolutely.
So that's the thing that I just wanted to clarify. But, and this is just my observation, I think it makes it a lot harder. And I don't know whether that's a fair observation, but my gut tells me that in that situation, when you have this thing, and maybe it's just the lack of clarity or the fact that you're not all thinking in the same way for a team environment. And I'm just saying, let's say that we were doing a community project, and let's say me and a few friends got together and we were doing, a really good, a good cause, supporting, etc. And one person wanted to be paid for the work. I not a great example, but do you see what I'm saying?
I think it is a good example.
Yeah, so it feels like that stuff is still accessible. So they could have all been paid and all singing from the same hymn sheet, and all of that stuff's accessible, but it almost feels like when money just gets in the way of being able to access that. Whereas the Europeans, like you said, that it was the greatest for some of them, and they've all had individual accolades, but what they had and what they experienced, obviously because they won as well. But I think even if they hadn't won, the sort of the camaraderie and that feeling of togetherness and being part of the whole rather than individual. And this is always something in golf, which is really difficult because you play individually all the time. And so I think that's just really interesting for me, that when you take money out of it, and this sort of comes into community work and stuff like that, that it just makes these life-centered things that we're trying to achieve a bit easier.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and that might be something we have to return to in depth in another episode. Let me respond quickly. I want to make a couple of points. The first is, it's very, very important in general, because it comes up in the work. Sometimes people think, if I love what I do and I do it anyway and I'm passionate, somehow I don't need to be paid, or I shouldn't be paid. Right? Now, that's a mistake, actually. I'm not saying for the European golfers, but in principle, money doesn't need to get in the way one way or the other, although I acknowledge it often does. But if I'm doing what I love, the idea would be I do what I love and I'm going to do it whether there's money or not. And if I'm doing what I love, or something I'm passionate, community project or beautiful work of art, and there is money, it would be a tremendous shame for me to think, oh, that money makes it feel heavier or less joyful, or I'm a less good person, or that would be a lot of projection, actually. And there are many people in the world, and we've moved a long way away from elite golfers, but there are many people in the world who are doing things from the heart and from the soul, and beautiful things that are meaningful, but they have actually a negative view of money. And then they somehow think what I do is going to be more pure or more wonderful or more holy or whatever if there's no money. And because they have a view of money messes up the world, then money comes and they think, oh, this is messing up the project.
That's the trap.
So that's a trap. That's a trap. It's very common. So in principle, you're absolutely right. You could be paid for your golf or your project or your art, and still focus entirely on what brings you joy and passion and meaningful. In fact, that's what I would love. If everyone in the world could work on what they loved and still be well paid, that's great. I think you're right, though, given that is a very common idea, money gets in the way, money messes things about. My guess is for those European golfers, and it's true, the Ryder Cup really is for them about belonging and camaraderie and all of this sort of stuff. They really love it. My guess is for them, both as a symbol and actually with their own psychology, they probably do feel that by saying, no, we don't want money, it probably does make them feel not just better, but more together. And it probably reflects back to them this story, which isn't necessary, but wow, we're really doing this for our love or for our passion. So in reality, they could still be paid and still have every bit as much love and passion. But because they are a little bit caught in the projection, let's say, it sort of releases them and echoes that back. And then we all buy into the story of the romance, and it's wonderful. So again, what I read into that, I don't know their psychology, but I'm guessing it's something like that. But what we love as the people watching is we love these people giving their time, giving 100%. We see the emotion, doing it just from the depths of their heart or their soul. That speaks to us, right? I think that's because there's a part of all of us, all human beings, we're all struggling with, the problem of money and the pull of the industrial system, even though we want to do things we love, but we feel heavy with all of this stuff. So when we see a group of people who are powerfully acting out this kind of story, which is we're just going to come here for the camaraderie and the fulfillment and the meaning and all of that. So, and we see it, I think, as well as we like the golf and we're happy Europe won. I think we love that story because there's a bit in each of us who would love to live that story more and more fully. That's what I think is going on.
I think you've touched on something really important, that it does activate something within ourselves. And that's often the case, right? When you get stirred, it's because you see, and that could be a positive or a negative,
exactly,
that you're like, that's a clear reflection. So we're all kind of looking for this life-centered approach where, you know, money doesn't get in the way. And that doesn't mean that money can't be involved. It just doesn't get in the way, which is, I think, what we're trying to do on this podcast is talk about money in a way which is, yeah, money's there, money's everywhere. I think that was something that was in the first episode. I remember, you talking about, can't get away from it. It's part of the way the world operates, but does it get in the way of being able to access certain things? And clearly we, I definitely identify. And then, like what you were saying was so important, that, in order to do good work and to be nourished and nourish others, like, we can't be foolish. It does take money to have organizations and structures where you can come together with other people to do good work, and having money and financial support allows you to do that. And so I see a lot of people, especially in community work, etc., like you said, that, well, we've got to be pure intentioned and all of this sort of stuff, and then they're under resourced, and we've talked about that. And so I think it's just so important to be conscious of that. And clearly these people are already well resourced, so they can take part and not be paid, but that's the situation that they find themselves in. A lot of people do find themselves in situations where they don't feel like that they can ask for money, or they can ask for the support in order to do, the life-centered stuff, which I think is
I think that's right. So that, I think it's good, because we're honouring the other side. What we're not saying, and I think this is the point you're making, we're not saying everyone should do stuff for no money, and we're not being stupid and thinking it's easier for some people than others. Although it's worth noticing how much voluntary and community work goes on in this country. And the vast amount of that is done with people who are still worrying about paying their bills at the end of the month, right? So there is something about aligning with things that you give purely from your heart that's very much in plain sight in society. But you're right, what we wouldn't want anyone to hear, we wouldn't want this conversation to feed into people who already have the projection that asking for money is bad, being paid is bad, I should give away my time. We're not saying that. I think we're saying deeper. If I can become more conscious of all sides and not stuck on one, to recognize that deep down in the human condition, this is my suggestion, whether I have money or not, whether it's easy to pay bills or not, all of us yearn for a paradigm in us and in the world where we can really go for what does feel fulfilling, meaningful, joyful, connected, whether there's money or not. And therefore, when we see sporting people who are often seen as almost the symbol of just earning ridiculous amounts of money, elite sports people get paid huge amounts of money. When we see these people give their time and their energy and go through blood, sweat and tears for no money, there's something, as you say, that comes alive in us about that story. And I want to take it at least one more step. What we saw yesterday, and yes, they'd won, and it's always good to win, but the way they won together in a sport that's very individual, I get a sense of why it's so important to them. These are people who spend the vast amount of their life individually. They train by themselves, they compete against each other, they win or lose as separate individuals in competition with each other, right? That is the money paradigm. We're taught that we're all separate individual economic units and we have to compete in the marketplace, and some win and many lose, right? And what we see is they come together, and what I think I see in that is how much they love coming together and being in a team and winning and losing together. And all right, they're competing against another team. I recognize that. So what we often say in the life-centered logic is what we get when we do that is a lot of the stuff that we hope money would buy for us, but it never does. So you see them, they've got stories to share, they've got connection, friendship, trust, bonding, shared endeavor. And so it's not just that they're doing it, but the reward they get without money, again, we see that's so precious to these people. So I think there's a little bit of us that just kind of resonates with that whole story. And again, I want to say it's not that the Americans wouldn't have been delighted if they'd won, but there was a lot of talk this week about the Europeans having a real deep bond and a real team spirit. And I also think it's fascinating, given this conversation, that the Europeans won the vast majority of the points in the Gulf that required team setup. When they had to work in pairs, in relationship, the Europeans were very dominant in the Gulf. And yesterday, when they all worked individually, one against the other, the Americans were very dominant. So I find something very fascinating, even in the structure of the Gulf points, about who's operating more from an individual, independent, my time, my money paradigm, and who is, I think, experiencing, but at least reflecting back to us, that joy of doing things in relationship together for a shared endeavor. Maybe I'm being overly romantic this morning and overly fanciful, but I think there's something in this story that we should pay attention to.
Bring it on. There can be no shortage of romance when it comes to the Ryder Cup. That's all I'm going to say. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it is golf, and it can seem trivial, but underneath, I think there's some really important messages and reflections on, like, a microcosm of what's happening outside, and we can all tap into the feelings that we have when, like you said, there's no clarity around the money situation and money getting in the way of certain things, especially on the life-centered approach. I think we spoke a couple of weeks ago, what would you be doing if it wasn't for the chase of money? I know this isn't, we're talking about money and time here, but it still is such an important question just to ponder on. What would you be doing if you weren't chasing for money? And I think that's a great sort of question to reflect on. I'm conscious that we're sort of coming towards the end of our Ryder Cup special. What are the takeaways from today, Tim, if we're going to wrap it up?
Yeah. I mean, the one question you mentioned never goes away, which is, what is it I would do if money were no problem? And to really reflect on that. And then, as Peter Koenig, founder of this work, often says, whatever that is, see if you can accelerate it or do it more fully or sooner with and without money. It's really about that. But the specific thing, I think I'm very touched by this idea of the joy of shared endeavor, or that step from thinking of myself, maybe in my work or whatever, as I'm an independent economic money earning unit, versus getting together with others to create something, or even just seeing myself as something bigger. So anyone listening to this, wherever you're at with your money questions and your money situation, maybe just view the same questions or the same challenges through two lenses deliberately. First, notice, do I tend to think of myself as individual, which I think most of us do with money, my pension, my savings, and how does that feel and what avenues does it open for you? And the other would be to think, what happens if I think about this in any way as collective or shared, or with my work, ways I might just embrace more that sense of a shared endeavor. And that might look like very, very different things to different people. Again, it's a whole other conversation. Play with this idea of, am I coming from a very independent individual paradigm? Or what happens when I emphasize the value and the joy of relationship and connectedness with my money questions?
Lovely. Let's leave it there.
All right.
Bask in the glory. Have a good day.
Mate.
Have a good day, Tim. See you next time.
See you soon. Bye-bye.